You're watching CTS, family-friendly television.
Hi and welcome to Rhonda London Live. On the show today, labor representatives have slammed the province's changes to the Employment Standards Act as an attack on vulnerable workers. They are especially upset over the Ontario government's plan to raise the maximum hours of work from 48 hours a week to 60. Overtime would still kick in after 44 hours. Labour Minister Chris Stockwell says that changes to the existing Employment Standard Act are needed to adapt to a changing workplace where more flexibility is needed. The president of the Ontario Federation of Labour, however, says that those changes will take us back to 1944, when a 60-hour work week was the standard. What do you think about all of this? Are the proposed changes to the Standards Act a step in the right direction or a big step backward? I want to hear your thoughts, and the phones will be open to take your calls when we come back right after this. The Ontario government is proposing some sweeping changes to the Employment Standards Act. Probably the most contentious is the plan to raise the maximum hours of work from 48 hours a week to 60. Overtime provisions would still take effect after 48 hours. Also, the 60 hours can be averaged over a three-week period. So that means an employee could theoretically work 72 hours one week, 48 the next, and 60 hours in the third week, and still be within the legislative parameters for overtime. With his thoughts on all of this, we're joined by Paul McKeever, a lawyer who specializes in civil litigation and employment law. He's also a member of the Freedom Party of Ontario. Paul, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
What are your thoughts on these proposed changes to the Employment Standards Act? The government says it's doing it in response to a changing workplace, that really the legislation needs to reflect how flexible our workforce needs to be.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's interesting, you know, in some ways there's way too much fanfare over this change, and in other ways it's the wrong type of fanfare, and maybe there should be loud fanfare. I'll tell you, on the first point, there are so many exemptions from the rule that says you may work no more than 48 hours. All professionals, lawyers, doctors, psychologists, etc., not included. For the most part, any supervisory people, not included. Superintendents, you name it. There are so many exemptions that there's really a limited class of people who are really even protected by the 48-hour work week to begin with. And then you ask yourself, well, what is this 48-hour period anyway? Does it mean you have to work 48, or you would have to work 60? No. It means that you may enter into a contract where it's possible to work 48 or 60 hours. And so what we're really talking about is a situation where we have legislation which prevents employees from choosing to work more than 48 hours, thereby protecting all of those employees who don't want to work more than 48 hours. So when you raise the limit to 60, those go-getters who want to work 60 will be interfering with the job security of those who only wanted to work 48. And that, I think, is the chief fear for some.
Is that part of the problem in any kind of legislation that addresses this issue? Because you're always going to have the people, particularly with overtime kicking in after 44 hours a week, you're going to have the people who are going to want that overtime. But then on the other hand, you might have particularly people with families, small kids at home, who absolutely do not want to work the overtime. So how do you achieve that balance to keep everybody happy?
Well, I think my answer would always be market forces. Here's a good example. You put in a 60-hour maximum work week, and we have all of these concerns that people are going to be working 60 hours, which, by the way, most of the people I see are working at least 60 hours a week anyway. But apart from that, you have to ask yourself, is that really going to pan out? Is everybody going to be working 60 hours? Or are people going to say, no, my family life's more important, I value my family life more than this particular job, so I'm going to look for a job in which I'm not required to work 60 hours. If you look at the minimum wage, there's the ability to enter into a contract where you get paid no more than the minimum. That doesn't mean that employers can force the market to receive no more than $6.95 or $7, whatever it is right now, per hour. The market still forces wages to the $60,000, $70,000 range for some jobs.
But isn't that a huge leap forward, though, from 48 hours maximum to 60? That's what the government is proposing.
Mm-hmm. Well, if you ask me, I mean, all you're really protecting, or all you're really doing when you're putting in those limits is preventing people from making the choices they want to make. If it's the case that nobody wants to work a 60-hour work week, nobody will. And if some people want to work a 60-hour work week, whereas others only want to work a 44-hour work week, those who want to work the longer hours will take the jobs that require the longer hours to be put in. And those who don't want to work the longer hours will find jobs where those hours aren't required.
But Paul, is it not only possible, but even probable that employers who want their employees to work the 60-hour work week will use this change legislation to bring that into effect?
Well, there's two things. One is certainly they could propose to their employees that they work a greater number of hours. But if they were to force the employees to do so, those employees could come see me and say, look, my agreement was for 48 hours a week, or no more than 48 hours a week. My employer now wants me to work 60, or else he's going to give me the can. Or it looks like he might be trying to do so. What can I do? Well, the answer is that if you are given the boot, or if you are forced to work 60 hours, your employer has just breached your employment contract, and you do already have a remedy in the courts.
But still, though, I mean, looking down the road, like 3 or 4 years, as new contracts are negotiated, you can, in all probability, have the situation where a person doesn't want to work the 60 hours, but is forced to, just because of how the field has evolved.
Yeah, well, those people...
And is that the direction our society wants to be going in? Other countries are going in the opposite direction.
The best way to find out what way society wants to go is to allow them to try it. So if we're not sure whether, you know, there's going to be a market for a 60-hour work week, let them try it. And if, I mean, let's say, for example, we had set a limit of 120 hours. That doesn't mean that there's someone out there silly enough to work 120 hours. I don't even know if it's possible to do that in a week, but in any event. You see what I'm saying? That you have to find, just because you've given people flexibility doesn't mean they'll take advantage of it. And just because you've given one person the opportunity to do something doesn't mean that the other person has somehow had his wrist twisted. He hasn't been coerced, he certainly has been persuaded. He's competing now for the job that before he didn't have to compete for, because the law prevented him from having to compete with his fellow worker.
Well, you know from clients who come to you that there is an awful lot of intimidation that goes on in the workplace. Some of it perfectly legal, or at least you can't prove it in a court of law. Yeah. But there's certainly a lot of intimidation that goes on in our workforce today.
Yes, there certainly is, and
won't this law, like this change in the law, be a new stick that employers can use?
Well, I mean, you have to make a distinction between intimidation and just a desire to change the terms of the contract. If someone says, I want you now to work a 60-hour work week, you do have an option either to take that, to agree to those new terms, or to say, no, I disagree. And it's up to the other side then to say, well, do I want to accept the contract as is, or do I want to have us part ways? And if they want to part ways, then there's a mechanism that they have to follow for that too. It's not a simple matter of there's the door.
But how many employers, or employees I should say rather, are going to want to even let it come to that?
Well, certainly all of the ones who
You've got a family at home, you know, 2 kids, a mortgage payment to make.
Right.
Who is going to want to say, you know, to turn down this overtime if it may end up in you losing your job, or worse yet, having to hire an employment lawyer and try to settle it in the courts?
Yeah. Well, I mean, some people will actually look forward to that 60-hour work week. I'm not saying I would, or you would, or that even a majority would. But unless somebody is looking forward to that 60-hour work week, then the people who only want to work 48 don't have anything to worry about. So what we're really concerned about is our possible replacement worker. We're actually not concerned so much about the employer intimidating us as other people potentially wanting to take our job, as we call it, on different terms when we don't want to accept those new terms. And I don't think in a so-called adaptable environment for jobs and the economy, we can say, look, we're going to prevent this person from working extra time. There's too much need for flexible hours.
Do you think then, given that argument, that there should be any limit at all?
I would
say 60.
I would say that what you need to do with an Employment Standards Act, if you're going to do anything with it, is say, look, these are the default positions. If you and your employer don't discuss in advance what the maximum number of hours you're going to work, how much you're going to get paid, what are your overtime provisions, and those kinds of things, then these ones will prevail. But Section 3 of that Act prevents employers and employees from contracting out of any given provision there. They can't waive their rights, even if they want to. And so you cannot have a flexible or adaptive work environment if the state is determining, without knowing much about each particular job setting, what will be the hours, what will be the pay, and etc.
Okay, I want to talk to you more about this, but first we have to take a commercial break. What do you think about all of this? Is 60 hours a week, is that too much? That's the question we're asking today. The number to call is 905-332-3131. We're back with more right after this. Welcome back to Rhonda London Live. Today we're talking about proposed changes to the Employment Standards Act. The Ontario government wants to change the number of hours that you could be working in a given week from the maximum, which is 48 hours now, to a potential 60, and overtime would still kick in after 44 hours. That's probably the most contentious part of the whole proposed change. What do you think about that? The number to call is 905-332-3131 or 416-203-0302. We're joined in studio by lawyer Paul McKeever. He specializes in civil litigation and also in employment law. And Paul, our lines are very, very busy today. A lot of strong opinions on this subject today. So let's go right to Olive on line 2. Go ahead, Olive. You are on the air.
Hi there.
Hi, Olive. Go ahead. You're on the air.
Okay, I just want to know, when the Sunday shopping law came into effect, I work in retail. We were told that if we worked on Sundays, we were going to be paid overtime. And that has become part of our regular work week. Mm-hmm. What's going to happen with the 60 hours now? We're not going to have a choice. We're going to have to work 60 hours. It's like, it's like you said, we have mortgages, we have children we're putting through school, we have car payments, we got to put food on our table, and now they're going to make us work 60 hours a week.
Olive, you bring up an excellent point. Now, for somebody who finds herself, in Olive's position working retail, if you run the math, it may end up to be a lot cheaper to take somebody like Olive and make her work on average a 60-hour week rather than hire a couple of part-time employees. It might work out if you run the math. So any employer, if they have the potential to do that, is going to, I mean, you'd be crazy not to. Mm-hmm.
That's true. I'm not sure what to say to that exactly. I do know that you must keep in mind that there are many exemptions already to all of these provisions. So whereas we have a certain group of people who have been protected by the Act for a certain number of years, anywhere from supervisors, superintendents, lawyers, doctors. Sorry about the lawyers and doctors, right. But they work long hours too, and it's not exactly a new thing for everybody to have been working 60 hours or thereabouts, but it would be new to those people who are prior to to this proposal been protected. But keep in mind, you're being protected not from the employer, you're being protected from your fellow worker or the potential worker, the person who may want that job, who may want to work 60 hours. And you have to ask yourself, is it efficient, is it good for the economy to have people occupying positions that could be occupied by other people in a more cost-efficient way, or in a way that would help that new employee make the extra money they want to make their savings for their house, their car, etc.?
So I think the comments then from the president of the Ontario Federation of Labour are fair, that he says this is going to take us back to 1944, where the 60-hour work week was normal.
I think the 60-hour work week is normal. It's not normal for, as I say, for the people who are protected by the Act from competition. But for just about everybody else, 60 hours is hardly unusual. Not to say that it's fun or that it's great, but for some people, the ability to work 60 hours without having to get permission from a director in the government through the employer would be a great benefit to them. People who want to work the overtime. Now, if we could just get the federal government from taxing them at an increased rate on that overtime pay, then they'd just be finally getting their chance to get ahead.
But doesn't it get worse, though? Because it's an average over 3 weeks. So, you know, the example that I used at the beginning of the show, it's perfectly within the realm of possibility. 1 week you could be forced to work 72 hours, the next week 48 hours, and the week after that 60 hours. It averages out to 60 in the long run. But working 72 hours in some positions, that cannot be safe.
We have to keep in mind that this is
even one of your clients, I don't think that I would want you representing me at the end of a 16 or an 18-hour day. I don't think you'd be at your best.
That's right. That's right. But you have to keep in mind, these rules are not about what the employer can force you to do. They're about what you and the employer may enter into in terms of an agreement at the beginning of your employment. So when you first speak with the employer and he says, I want someone who's going to work a 48-hour week, if you agree to that, that's your contract, not the 60. What the legislation allows you to do is sit down with the employer, as you weren't allowed to do before if you were falling into certain classes of employee, and sit down with that employer and say, yes, let's have a 60-hour work week. So now it's possible, but you aren't required to work 60 hours. You're still in charge of your own life. You still set your own terms and you negotiate with your employer, because this is just a relationship that you're negotiating, much like a spousal relationship. And you set the terms, and either you like the terms or you don't like the terms. And if someone tries to change the terms after you've already agreed to some, then they're the wrongdoer, not you.
Okay. What do you think about this? Let's go to John on line 5. Go ahead, John. You're on the air.
What is this guy dreaming? Really? You really think there's an agreement between the employer and the employee? It's just a matter of what the employer sets down. That's the idea of having the whole thing down there about a certain number of hours that you're required to work. The employer's gonna push it as far as he can get it.
Okay, John, you bring up an interesting point. And using the scenario that you've used, where you're sitting down, you don't even have the job, you're negotiating your new contract. Well, your potential employer could say you may be required to work a 60-hour week, averaged over 3 weeks, but that's allowable under the law. It may or may not come to that. And maybe a year into the job, you're finding that you're consistently working your 60-hour week.
Right. Well, I think John does bring up another good point, though, and that is, I think his main criticism was, where's this conversation? I never had a conversation. They said, here's the job, we'll set the terms, and here's the money. And that, I think, has to change. One thing that the law could be, one change that could be made to the law is to say, look, here are the points that are addressed by the Employment Standards Act. These are the default positions. An employer and an employee must address the following points when negotiating their contract. And if they do not, then, you know, the Employment Standards Act prevails. And if the person wanted to have that negotiation but couldn't because the other person wasn't willing, then there might be a remedy for that as well. But there has to be an informed and consensual environment for making these deals.
How consensual can that environment be, though? If you're interviewing for a new job and you know that there are 100 other people who are vying for the job, and you don't really want to work that 60-hour week. You have a family life, you have other things going on other than the 9-to-5 day, and your potential employer says you may be required to work 60 weeks. You'd be very foolish if you needed that job, knowing that there are 100 other people vying for that job, to say, oh, I'm sorry, I won't do that.
I agree, and not everybody will have the same family situation. Some will have the ability to work a 60-hour work week, and in fact, maybe they were looking for a 60-hour work week. So to have a law that prevents that person from accepting the job, or rather, you know, that prevents that person from taking on a 60-hour work week job, simply because someone else didn't want to do so, I don't think is very democratic or free. It's simply saying, look, if some people don't want to work it, then nobody's going to be able to work it, and that way no one has to worry about job security. I don't think that's fair. Not everybody has the same tolerances or the same life circumstances, and those who want to work more should be permitted to do so.
Okay, well, we've got time for one more phone call. Let's go to Aileen on line 8. Go ahead, Aileen, you're on the air.
Thank you, Rhonda. I'm just wanting to comment on that whole business. I thought 60-hour week sounded absolutely ridiculous. I remember, I'm an older person now, but when I was younger, I went to work for a company that was just setting up its head office here in Toronto, and we had to work overtime. And when we said that it was getting too much, they said, look, you're only working a 40-hour week. We can force you to make 48 hours. We can insist you work 48 hours. And so a little bit of overtime isn't going to hurt you. But the problem was that what had happened to me was I was getting so weary, I was almost ready to burst into tears. I told my mother, she said, you're ready for a nervous breakdown. I think that 60 hours a week may be fine for some people, but if you get into a situation where companies say, we're going to have this, aren't they going to be threatening those who want to work less, feel that they cannot? Work that length of time. And so if they're only able to work a 48-hour week, then I think that they may have their opportunities jeopardized just because the employer is hooked on this 60 hours.
Elaine, you bring up an interesting and an excellent point, and I think it's perfectly valid, because maybe the intention of the law is not to force employees to work a 60-hour week, but you have to admit that it does open up the realm of possibility to that.
Well, it opens up the possibility that people will be working a 60-hour week, that's for sure. And it certainly opens up the possibility that someone will choose to work 60 hours rather than to change jobs. But that too is a choice. And there are people who do want to work 60 hours, or 70, or 80, or even 90. And in fact, Bay Street is full of them. So I don't want to see a law that, as there is even now, that prohibits the making of contracts that, provide for longer hours. But I also don't want to see any law that allows an employer to unilaterally force an employee to work more hours. That's not the law now. That's not the way it's being proposed. And currently the law protects you from that kind of thing.
Paul McKeever, our time is gone, but I want to thank you so much for joining us today on the show. It's always nice talking to you.
Thank you.
Don't go away. We're going to continue this conversation. Phone's quite busy today, but we have a number of lines that are open. The number to call is 905-332-3131. We're back with more Rhonda London Live right after this. Welcome back to Rhonda London Live. Today we're talking about proposed changes to the Employment Standards Act in Ontario. Joining our conversation, Brian O'Keefe. He's the Secretary-Treasurer of the Canadian Union of Public Employees in Ontario, and he sits on the National Executive Board as Regional Vice President for Ontario. Brian, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
So how do you feel about probably the most contentious part of this whole proposal? The changes to the Employment Standards Act are sweeping. What we're talking about today is probably one of the most contentious proposals, and that is changing the maximum hours of work for a week from 48 hours maximum to 60. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, the hours of work is one issue, but I mean, the larger issue here is that the Employment Standards Act is totally out of date. It hasn't been revamped in any significant way in the last 20 years. And this was an opportunity for the government to do something really, really significant. In the modern economy, there's a huge area that's outside workers that are outside representation by unions, non-standard work, jobs that have little job security and few benefits and very, very little protection. And with the proliferation of small workplaces, these are the areas where protection is required. And particularly this is the impact of globalization. And the government failed miserably to address those issues. And these are workers that need protection, and they're not getting it. On the hours of work issue, It's very, very important. I would have expected the province to have moved in a progressive direction on this. What's happening in Europe, I think, is the standard. France has now moved to a 35-hour week. A huge chunk of the German economy is on 35 hours, and Spain and Italy are also moving in that direction. And what does this government do but go in a totally contrary direction to a 60-hour work week, our maximum work week, which is totally ridiculous and sets a completely inappropriate standard and an inappropriate signal to employers.
Is that your biggest objection to all of this? Even if in effect it doesn't, if employers don't jump on this and start forcing employees to work 60 hours a week, does it set the tone or send out a message that this is the direction that the province is going in, that we're moving toward a 60-hour work week?
It certainly sends that signal, but it's just one of many changes that have been made here. And as I say, my main complaint is the changes that haven't been made. There's a lot of workers out there that need protection in a very significant way, and the minimum wage is a big one. The minimum wage is $6.85 in the province of Ontario. In this day and age, it is inappropriate. It's hard to understand how a family can survive on that sort of a wage.
That works out to something like $14,000 a year.
That is correct, and but here again in Europe, the minimum wage is a lot higher. But there's a very huge element of the workforce that are outside representation by trade unions, and they need help, they need protection, and they're not getting it here. It's just not there. And
what would you say to critics that say, you know, doctors, lawyers, journalists, they all habitually work a 60-hour week or more. Maybe it's time for the other segment of our population to come into the real world.
We're not really talking about doctors and lawyers here. We're talking about workers who are struggling to survive, to make a living. And these are the people that need protection. Doctors and lawyers don't need protection. They are the beneficiaries of this society that we're living in right now. And what we're seeing is a polarization very much between the rich and the poor, with very little in the middle. And it's those people at the end of the totem pole. They're the ones that need protection. And that's what the Employment Standard Act should be doing, and I don't see it doing that. And I think it's a serious missed opportunity.
How problematic is it, too, that we see many people who are holding down maybe a full-time job and a part-time job on top of that? Now, if at your full-time job you're forced to work 60 hours, how problematic could that be if you're trying to make ends meet and you're holding down more than one job?
I think you zeroed in on something that's very important here. I've come across a lot of people, who, particularly young people. I think they're the people who are really going to be impacted by this. A lot of them now are holding down anywhere between 2 and 3 part-time jobs just to survive. And we're earning very little more than minimum wage, no protection, no job security, and now they're exposed to this new legislation that permits employers to drive them to a 60-hour work week. Totally unacceptable. And not only that, this is very much a ploy to avoid paying workers overtime as well, because of the rolling 3-week arrangement where it's averaged over a 3-week period, which means that employers can avoid paying overtime in a very significant way. It awards a huge amount of flexibility to employers and does very, very little of anything for employees.
So do you think these proposed changes good for business? Not so good for the working person?
I think it's a mistake to think that it's good for business. I think the government have caved in, and they certainly have appealed to the interests of the employers. There's no question about that. And one of the things that's most objectionable about this is that there's an exclusion for employers with a workforce of less than 50. So there's a huge chunk of the workforce that isn't protected here. I'm talking about the family leave provision here, which looked like it was a terrific, terrific benefit, but it's not really.
It's 10 days unpaid leave if you have a family crisis or a family emergency. That's part of the legislation. But as you pointed out, that's not for businesses with fewer than 50 employees.
Yeah, and really, what I'm trying to zero in here is the jobs in this day and age tend to be in smaller workplaces. 50 or fewer employees is a proliferation of small workplaces, and that's where workers need protection. And this family leave thing is wonderful. We support it, but it's not available to right across the economy. There's a huge segment of the workforce that has been excluded, and that's just not acceptable.
Okay, I want to talk to you more about that, but we have to take a commercial break. Phone's very busy today. When we come back, we'll get right to your calls. The number to call is 905-332-3131 or 416-203-0302. Welcome back to Rhonda London Live. The question we're asking today, a 60-hour work week, is that too much? Let's go right to Paul on line 6. Go ahead, Paul. You're on the air.
Oh, hello.
Hi, Paul.
Hi. My question is going to be about flexibility and the renegotiation of the possible contract. And I guess I have a scenario. If you have a 25-year-old young man, single, gung-ho, he's got the energy to put into the 60 hours, but a few years go by and he gets married, he has a couple of kids, and then he's kind of like, gee, this is too much, and goes to employer. I'm willing to work 50 hours, which is still above what most people work, because I need that 10 extra hours, for my family and whatever. Am I going to lose my job and not going to be able to feed my family and look after all those things, and my personal and mental health, because I've negotiated 60, but I really, after a couple of years, my life has changed and evolved.
Paul, you bring up an excellent point. And Paul McKeever was talking about the nice flexibility that this offers, because some people want the overtime and are more than willing to work those 60 hours. And so that's what he likes about this law. But what about in the scenario that we've just heard described? Because let's face it, situations and circumstances change. And maybe, when I was 25, a 60-hour work week wasn't so daunting as it is today.
Well, there's all sorts of double standards here. If overtime could be earned freely, that's another issue. Mm-hmm. But with this, with the 60 hours a week plus the 3-week rolling average, there are ways where the employer can avoid paying overtime here, which is totally unacceptable. If the employer had to pay overtime, you would see a lot less people working extra hours. That's not always the case. In certain large workplaces, it does happen on a fairly constant basis. But my union feels very strongly that we should be looking at a 40-hour work week and a maximum of 48 hours. There's a real health and safety issue here, and if people are going to be working excessive hours on an ongoing basis, it's going to be very detrimental to their health, and it's going to be very, very destructive to their families. It's not a direction that other countries are moving in. The progressive direction here is in Europe, where they have made significant strides, and we should be doing the same here in Canada.
Okay, let's go to Grace on line 3. Go ahead, Grace. You're on the air.
Hi, Rhonda. I love your show.
Oh, thank you, Grace.
I would like to address the issue of how they're going to incorporate the lunch hours into this. Mm-hmm. If I work 9 to 5, my employer does not count that as an 8-hour workday. He counts it as 7 hours. 1 hour is unpaid lunch. Mm-hmm. Now, if you add on to this the extra amount, how are they going to work a lunch hour into the second half of your workday? This will almost double your work time at work if this is what they're doing. Add to that a commute, and we're going to be getting practically no sleep before we go into work.
That's a good point, Grace. Yeah, bring in the rollaway cot and park it in the the parking lot or the office. And
yeah, I mean this is the absurdity of the whole thing. I mean, how are people going to be able to cope? I mean, there've got to be some limits here. There's got to be some protection for people. You can't look at this on an individual basis, offering flexibility to people. You've got to look at it at a societal level, and what sort of protections are there to look after people. And the people who really need protection are those workers that are outside unions and don't have that sort of protection. And that's why we have an Employment Standards Act. And this opens the floodgates and gives no protection at all that those people who desperately need it.
Okay, good point. Let's go to Glenn on line 4. Go ahead, Glenn. You're on the air.
Good afternoon.
Hi, Glenn.
I was going to ask your first guest, with his nice, sweet platitudes about flexibility and how wonderful the world would be. I was going to ask him, as a lawyer, if he had a particularly sensitive case where it was a heavy-duty workload on that particular issue for a very short period of time, and he insisted that his paralegals or his research assistants work a 16 or a 20-hour day to help him prepare for his case. If they had refused because they didn't want to work the overtime, would he be talking then about making a contract and an agreement with the employer, or would he just sack the employee because they weren't standing up to, or they weren't coming across with what he wanted? This whole idea of making the Employment Standards Act more employer-friendly is silly. It reminds me a lot of the movie we just saw recently called the Harlan County Wars, about the mines and what they did to the miners in the 30s and the 40s and the factory workers. My question, I guess, has changed a little bit because you have a union representative there.
Right.
That's how far are we going to let this go before we start talking in terms of a general strike? The government keeps pushing the envelope, whether it be with the teachers, with the water, with whatever government operation they want to privatize or set themselves apart from, so that there's a layer of extra protection between the actual service that's provided and the government itself. The government keeps pushing the envelope from one issue to another. Now it's the Employment Standards Act. What's going to be next? And how long is it going to be before we all bind together as the lower half of the economy and say no?
Okay, Glenn, I'm going to give Brian O'Keefe a chance to answer your question. Just to paraphrase, Brian, I guess he's asking, is this a hill worth dying on?
Well, I mean, he's absolutely right. This is just one of many examples of what this government is doing. I mean, there's been a dramatic change in this province. The approach to governing in this province has just changed so dramatically, and this is just one example of many. There's the whole issue of Walkerton, which illustrates very clearly the disastrous policies of this government around cutting the Ministry of Environment by the staff by 50%, and also cutting the budget by 50%. And you have a similar situation in the Ministry of Labour, where they've cut the budget of the Ministry of Labour in half, and a third of the employment standards officers who are supposed to be administering the Employment Standards Act, they have been laid off. They're gone. So one has got to ask, where's the compliance on this whole thing? The deck is stacked against working people in this province in a very, very gross way, and people are getting tired of it. And there's a lot of stuff going on right now, and it may well develop into some serious industrial action to bring this government to its senses.
Wow. Okay, tough talk. Let's go to Margaret on line 5. Go ahead, Margaret. You're on the air.
Hi there.
Hi. Go ahead, Margaret.
When I first heard this, I thought I was imagining it. I really didn't believe this could really be happening in the year 2000 in Canada, anywhere in the developed world. And we went through free trade, and we were promised all these things. We were going to have more people working. We were going to have less hours to work, more time for your family. Let's talk about Mike Harris and how the kids, if they do any damage, the parents are responsible for it. But who's going to be watching the kids? Because the parents will be working themselves to death.
All right, Margaret, you bring up an you bring up an excellent point, and I'd like you to respond to that, Brian.
Yeah, I mean, exactly. I mean, there's no provision here for people to have a personal life. And I just want to zero in on another very important issue, which is very much on the front burner in our union. That's the whole idea of workload. People are working longer hours now, harder than they've ever done in history. And it's reached the point now where we're seeing some very serious health issues in our workplaces. And we've got to do something about it. And this is going to reinforce the problems that we have already. And we've got to find some protection for workers that haven't got representation by a union. And the employment standards is the only thing that can do that, and this government has abysmally failed to provide the protection that's needed.
But Paul McKeever says if this legislation goes through, it doesn't mean that you're going to have to work a 60-hour week. It just gives you the possibility or the flexibility if you choose to do so.
But he also made the point that the market will rule. And the fact of the matter is that if you don't work the 60 hours, you're going to be out the door, and you're going to be replaced by somebody who is prepared to work the 60 hours. So what this government have done is they've upped the yardstick and made it impossible for working people not to do what the employer says.
Okay, we've got time for one more phone call. Let's go to Dave on line 7. Go ahead, Dave. You're on the air.
Yeah.
Hi, Dave.
Sorry. The thing is that the government is taking all the rights away from the workers before the unions, because I work for a company in Toronto and they let me go, okay, because I wouldn't go over the 12 hours. The 60-hour stuff has just given a blank check to all the companies in Ontario to say, you don't want to work your 60 hours, you're out the door. And if the government thinks that's not going to happen, they're just ruining this country, and they better get their act together and start talking to the people that are working without unions.
Okay, Dave, thank you so much for your phone call. What do you say to somebody like
that's there's an example of somebody who's a victim of this situation. But I just want to zero in on something else here that hasn't been addressed. The provisions around notice and severance. That's a huge area that the government totally ignored. The fact of the matter is, out there right now, employers have the right to hire and fire people at will. And there's very, very little protection of anything around proper notice. There should be really good, solid notice for people who are laid off from work, and there should be some provisions for retraining to get them into other jobs. There's none of that that's taken into consideration in this particular piece of legislation. And on the issue of severance, severance payments is restricted entirely to large workplaces. Small workplaces are excluded. Here again, a huge chunk of the workforce are entirely eliminated from severance payments. If you had some of these provisions in place, you probably would have a lot more security in the workplace. There would be a lot more protection for workers, and it's just not there.
Brian O'Keefe, I want to thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Don't go away. We'll be back with more Rhonda London Live and news from our medical files right after these messages, so stay tuned. From our medical files today, encouraging news for some alcoholics who want to cut out their drinking. Those who suffer alcoholism early in life may benefit from a drug that, while still experimental for treating alcoholism, is on the market for another purpose. CNN's Dr. Barry Kaufman explains.
Francisco Gomez started drinking alcohol 33 years ago when he was 15.
I took a liking to it right away. As some people drink water, I started drinking beer.
His drinking cost him 3 wives, 2 children, and several jobs. For people like Francisco Gomez who become hooked on alcohol before age 25, ondansetron, a drug approved for treating nausea and vomiting related to chemotherapy, may help their early onset alcoholism.
For the first time, we have the possibility of matching alcoholics to the specific treatment which helps them best. I think that this is a very bold way forward which will allow us to, in future, develop more powerful medications for the treatment of alcoholism.
Those with early onset alcoholism seem to have a disruption in specific brain chemicals, including serotonin. This chemical imbalance increases the urge to drink. It's thought ondansetron works by blocking serotonin receptors, which in turn decreases the craving for alcohol. As reported in the Journal of the American Medical Association, early onset alcoholics who took ondansetron along with counseling had significantly more days without drinking and fewer drinks per day when they did drink compared to those receiving counseling and a placebo. Study chief Dr. Bankole Johnson and his alcohol research colleagues found fewer side effects with ondansetron than with the placebo.
With this treatment, we hope that part of this cycle of destruction in terms of their lifestyle and livelihood will be aborted by taking ondansetron, if indeed it does go forward to become a marketed product for the treatment of early onset alcoholics.
Because he's part of an ongoing study, Francisco Gomez doesn't know if he received the real drug or the placebo. What he does know is that something made a difference.
I went from 12 beers a day to 0 beers a day, and that's been well over a year now.
Future studies will look at ondansetron alone and in combination with other medications. Since early onset alcoholism is linked to a family history of alcoholism, the hope is that one day a simple genetic test can be used to identify those most likely to benefit from the drug therapy. I'm Dr. Barry Kaufman reporting.
Don't go away. I'll be right back with a preview of what's coming up tomorrow on Rhonda London Live, right after this. And that's our show for today. Thanks for watching. Tomorrow, should prisoners be put to work and should they be forced to pay for their own room and board? The Ontario government says the answer is yes, and we'll take a look at this controversial proposal and tell you all about it. That's coming up tomorrow on the show. I hope you'll join me. In the meantime, have a great day.
You're watching CTS, family-friendly television.